Over the past 2 weeks, we've been walking together through the season following Epiphany, listening for how God's glory is revealed. In Seeing the Light, we spoke about how God breaks into the darkness, not because the darkness is ready, but because God is faithful. And last week, in the Power of Presence, we reflected on a God who does not remain distant or abstract, but who draws near, who stays, who is present even when we feel unsure or unsteady. Those sermons reminded us that God reveals glory by showing up, by shining light where we least expect it, and by refusing to abandon us in the middle of our lives. Today, Isaiah asks us to take the next step, because this passage is not only about seeing God's light, or even about trusting God's presence. It is about what God does with those who God has called, formed, and sustained. It is about being given, not just guidance, not just reassurance, but given as a light. Isaiah 49 opens with the voice of the servant, speaking to the farthest reaches of the world. This is someone who knows that they have been called by God, named by God, shaped long before they understood what their life would require of them. And yet, almost immediately, we hear something unexpected. The servant admits weakness, discouragement, a sense that the work entrusted to them may have been for nothing. This is not the voice of someone who is standing at the beginning of their calling, full of confidence and clarity. This is the voice of someone looking back, someone who has tried to be faithful and is not sure that it has mattered. And that is where the text meets many of us. We know what it is like to believe that God has called us and also to feel unsure. We know what it is like to show up, to serve, to love, to pray, and to wonder quietly whether any of it has made any difference. Isaiah does not rush past that tension. God does not silence it. Instead, God speaks directly into it. The heart of this passage and this sermon is God's response. It is too light a thing. God's purpose is larger than what the servant can see. God's glory is not exhausted in what feels successful or complete, and the light God gives does not stop with us. It is meant to reach far beyond us. This morning, we listen for what it means to be given as a light, even when the path feels uncertain and the work feels unfinished. The servant begins by speaking about being called long before anyone else could see it. The Lord called me before I was born. While I was in my mother's womb, he named me. This is not said to impress us. It is not said to elevate the servant above others. It is said to anchor the servant's story in God, God's initiative, rather than human achievement. Before the servant ever spoke a word, before the servant even understood their purpose, God was already at work, forming, shaping, naming. The calling did not begin with a decision or a moment of clarity. It began with God's attention. Isaiah uses language that echoes Israel's own story. God speaks to Israel as one formed in the womb, chosen, shaped, and sustained not because of their strength or their faithfulness, but because of God's promise. Here, the same language is applied to the servant. What once described a people now describes a person who has taken that calling into their own life. This reminds us that the calling is not primarily about what we do. It is about who we belong to. Too often we talk about vocation as if it is something that we discover once we have enough information or confidence. But Isaiah tells us a different story. Calling often becomes clear only in hindsight. We live into it before we ever can name it. We discover it while we are already in motion, sometimes long after we have already grown tired. The servant says that God made their mouth like a sharp sword, that God hid them in the shadow of God's hand. There's a strange tension here. On the one hand, the servant is given words that matter. On the other hand, much of their work remains hidden. God equips the servant, but God also conceals the full scope of what is happening. That combination may feel familiar to many of us. Many of the most faithful things that we do never feel dramatic. That does not mean that they are passive or inconsequential. Often they are faithful precisely because they quietly and persistently resist what is wrong. Words spoken quietly, acts of care that feel like they go unnoticed, years of showing up without applause or recognition. And yet, Isaiah insists that hiddenness is not the same as absence. God can be deeply at work even when we feel tucked away, even when our efforts seem small. Then comes the phrase that can easily be misunderstood. God says to the servant, "You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified." This is not about replacing Israel, nor is it about elevating one person above others. It is about someone accepting, in a particular way, the role that God has always given to God's people. To be Israel is to be shaped for God's purpose in the world. It is to be called into a relationship so that God's character might be seen more clearly. The servant does not claim this role for themselves. It is spoken over them by God. And that is an important distinction. We do not assign ourselves the task of revealing God's glory. We receive it. We are named for it. The weight of the calling does not rest on our shoulders alone. It rests on God's faithfulness. This section of Isaiah reminds us that before there is success or failure, before there is visibility or recognition, there is belonging. God's claim comes first. God's forming comes first. And when our sense of purpose feels uncertain, Isaiah invites us to remember that God's work in us began long before we were aware of it and will continue long after our understanding falls short. After speaking about being called and formed by God, the servant says something that can catch us off guard. "I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing and vanity." There is no denial here, no spiritual spin, no attempt to rush to resolution. The servant tells the truth about how the work feels. Notice that Scripture does not shame the servant for his honesty. God does not interrupt. God does not correct the servant for a lack of faith. Instead, God allows the lament to stand. Faithfulness, Isaiah reminds us, includes the courage to speak truthfully about disappointment. The servant has done what God has asked. They have spoken, labored, endured, and still it feels as though nothing has changed. The words "in vain" carry the weight of exhaustion, of efforts that seem to evaporate as soon as it is offered. Many of us recognize that feeling, not only in our faith, but in our lives. We know what it's like to pour ourselves into relationships that remain strained, to pray for healing that does not come, to work for justice and see little progress, to serve faithfully in the church and wonder anyone even notices or whether it matters at all. Isaiah gives voice to that experience, and in doing so, he offers us permission to stop pretending. What makes this moment especially powerful, though, is what the servant does next. The lament does not turn into resignation. Instead, the servant says, "Yet surely my cause is with the Lord, and my reward with my God." This is not confidence in outcomes. It is trust in God's seeing. The servant places the meaning of the work back into God's hands, not because the servant understands it, but because the servant knows who God is. This is where the message of Isaiah connects deeply with what we reflected on last week. God's presence does not guarantee ease or clarity. God's presence does not, it's a nearness. It's a guarantee that God will not remove us from the struggle, but will be present with us throughout it, and that the labor that we go through is never wasted in a way that we may feel that it could be. The servant's faith does not consist in certainty. It consists in endurance. And that endurance matters because the calling of the servant is not about immediate success. It is about fidelity. It is about staying oriented towards God even when the results do not line up with expectations. Isaiah reminds us that feeling discouraged does not disqualify us from being used by God. If anything, it places us right where God often works most deeply. There is a temptation, especially in faith communities, to equate God's blessing with visible fruit, growth, impact, recognition. But Isaiah disrupts that equation. The servant's sense of failure does not mean that God's purposes have failed. It means that those purposes are unfolding on a timeline and in a way that the servant cannot yet see. This is a hard word, but it is also a gracious one, because it means that when we feel worn down, uncertain, or quietly disappointed, we are not outside of God's will. We may be standing directly within it. God's glory is not only revealed in moments of clarity and strength, it is revealed in perseverance, in honesty, and in quiet acts of entrusting our unfinished work back to God. Isaiah does not resolve the tension here by minimizing the servant's pain. Instead, God responds by expanding the vision, by reminding the servant that what feels like failure is not the final word. Faithfulness that looks small or ineffective may, in fact, be participating in something far larger than we imagine. After the servant has spoken honestly about weariness and disappointment, God finally speaks. And what God says does not dismiss the servant's experience. Instead, God widens the horizon. God says, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the survivors of Israel." Now that phrase, "too light a thing," can sound strange to our ears. At first glance, it almost feels dismissive, as if restoring God's peoples were somehow insignificant. But that is not what God means. God is not minimizing the work of the servant that's already been done. God is saying that the servant's faithfulness has always been a part of something larger than what the servant could see. Restoration matters deeply to God. The healing of God's people matters, but God's purposes does not stop there. God's mercy refuses to remain contained. So God continues, "I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." The servant is not merely sent with a message. The servant is given, offered, entrusted, placed into the world as a living sign of what God is doing. That distinction is important. The light does not draw attention to itself. Light allows others to see what was already there, but hidden. To be a light is not to dominate or control. It is to make visible the presence of an activity of God. And here in Isaiah, that visibility comes not through power or triumph, but through faithfulness that endures through hardship. This is where we need to be careful not to misunderstand what Isaiah is saying. Being a light to the nations does not mean going out and conquering, persuading, or proving superiority. It does not mean possessing all the answers or forcing belief. According to Isaiah, the light shines precisely through obedience, humility, and even affliction. The servant does not save the world through their own strength alone. God is the one that saves, but that does not mean that God will not make use of the servant's efforts to do so. The servant's role is to serve how they are able, to remain faithful, to bear witness with their life, even when that life is costly. This expands the servant's calling beyond Israel, but it does not erase Israel. Instead, it reveals that God's work with Israel has always been for the sake of the world. What God does among God's people is meant to illuminate something larger: God's character, God's justice, God's steadfast love. And this is where Isaiah speaks to the church today. It is tempting to believe that faithfulness is only worthwhile if it produces immediate, visible results. But Isaiah insists that God's purposes are often broader than we can measure. What feels small, hidden, or unfinished to us may be a part of the light that will reach far beyond our own context. The servant does not see the full scope of what God is doing. They only know the weight of their own labor. But God sees how that labor participates in salvation that stretches to the ends of the earth. This is both humbling and freeing. It is humbling because it reminds us that while we are a part of God's work, we are not the center of it. And it is freeing because it means we do not have to carry the outcome all on our own. God's salvation is God's responsibility. Our calling is to do what we can and to remain faithful. To be given as a light is not to be guaranteed success or comfort. It is to trust that God can be with us and use the lives that feel incomplete, efforts that feel fragile, and obedience that feels costly. God's glory is revealed not by avoiding weakness, but by working through it. And that is why God says it is too light a thing to stop at restoration alone. God's vision is bigger than the servant's exhaustion, bigger than the servant's disappointment, bigger even than the servant's understanding. The light that God gives is meant to shine further than the servant ever imagined. As Isaiah moves towards the end of this portion of the servant's story, the tone shifts once more. After speaking of light that reaches the nations, we hear a sobering description of how that light is received. The servant is called one deeply despised, abhorred by the nations. This is not the response that we might expect after such a sweeping promise. The servant is faithful, obedient, and formed by God, but still rejected. Isaiah does not hide this tension. Being given as a light does not guarantee affirmation. In fact, the very faithfulness that reveals God's glory may provoke resistance. The servant's life becomes a point of confrontation, not because the servant seeks conflict, but because God's truth unsettles the way things are. Faithfulness here does not avoid conflict. Sometimes it creates it because the light exposes what the world would rather keep hidden. And yet, rejection is not the end of the story. God speaks again, promising that kings will see and stand, that rulers will bow, not because the servant has overpowered them, but because God is faithful. The recognition comes later. The vindication belongs to God. The servant is not responsible for forcing understanding or securing honor. This moment in Isaiah points forward. It anticipates a pattern that we will see again and again in Scripture, a pattern Christians recognize most clearly in the life of Jesus. God's glory is revealed not through domination, but through humility, not through avoiding of the suffering, but through the faithfulness throughout it. That does not make the cost any easier. Isaiah does not pretend that obedience is painless, that to be given as a light means standing in places where misunderstanding and rejection are possible and most likely will happen. It means trusting that God's purposes are at work even when our faithfulness is met with silence or resistance. But this is where hope quietly enters the story. The servant is not asked to justify themselves. They are not asked to prove their worth. God does that. God names the servant as chosen, honored, and upheld. The servant's task is not to secure recognition, but to remain faithful to the calling that they have received. For those of us listening today, this matters deeply, because there are moments when faithfulness feels lonely, when doing what is right does not bring affirmation, when choosing love, justice, or truth comes with a real cost. Isaiah does not tell us that those moments mean that we have failed. He tells us that those moments may be the very places where God's glory is being revealed most clearly. God's promise is not that the servant will be spared rejection. The promise is that the rejection will not have the final word. God's faithfulness will outlast misunderstanding. God's purpose will stand even when the servant must wait to see them fulfilled. Throughout this passage, Isaiah has been reminding us that God's glory is revealed in ways we do not always expect. Not only in clarity, not only in strength, not only in moments when everything comes together, but in faithfulness that endures, in obedience that feels costly, and in trust that places unfinished work back into God's hands. The servant is not asked to create the light. The servant is given as light. This frees us from the burden of thinking everything depends on us. The light we carry does not originate from us. It is God's, and that means we are not responsible for sustaining it, proving it, or making it effective on our own. We are called to bear it, sometimes quietly, sometimes visibly, often imperfectly, trusting that God will do what only God can do with it. Isaiah does not promise that this calling will always feel rewarding. The servant experiences exhaustion, discouragement, and rejection, and yet God remains faithful. God sees what the servant cannot. God completes what the servant cannot finish. God's purposes stretch farther than the servant's sight. This is good news for us, because many of us are carrying callings that feel unfinished. We are showing up in places where the results are hard to see. We are loving people who may never thank us. We are praying prayers whose answers feel delayed or unclear. Isaiah does not tell us that we have failed, that this is because we didn't try hard enough or believe enough. He invites us to trust that God's glory is still being revealed, even here. Epiphany reminded us that God's light shines into the world not as a spectacle, but as a gift. And sometimes that gift takes the form of ordinary people, faithfully living where God has placed them. So today, we do not leave with pressure. We leave with promise. God is at work in ways that we cannot yet see. God is faithful to the call God has spoken, and the light God gives will reach further than we can imagine, not because we are strong enough, but because God is faithful enough. May we trust that, and may we carry the light that we have been given with humility, courage, and hope. Amen.